a good call, probably.
Broadcast is
6 o'clock, so that clock's a little faster.
I think from here.
We can have an empty chair on a pen.
Symbolism. For a life. Yeah. Hey, it's nice. She was the one that I said was asking about the marketing questions.
So it's Robert we're missing?
Yes. Which, driving from Barstow to here and probably working this morning. We're live.
Oh my goodness, the pressure.
Yeah.
Do you know those YouTube channels that are broadcasting town meetings that haven't taken place in 10 years and are just a live stream of an empty room that's been going for like
And they've never had the room.
Yeah.
There you go.
And nobody ever shows up. And it's, the water board of East Pig's Knuckle. And they just no one, they never meet, they're never quarried, and it's just this transparency, sunshine law thing.
There you go.
Yeah.
But it's live. Our thing, I like to go to our local city council meetings.
Yeah.
And we hang out at the bar, they have a live stream, and we wait until they get to our agenda item, and then we walk down. And it saves, it's 3 hours at the bar instead of 3 hours in the city council meeting with no alcohol. Listening to locals complain about, don't build that here.
Yeah. That hog confinement unit can go down the road to someone else's town.
Yeah.
That fellow with the portrait at the end of the room there looks very cheeky.
How do you think he feels about DRM?
It's a balderdash. He looks mischievous.
Yes, he looks
Right. Balderdash.
What was the word from hearing?
Oh, scallywag?
Scofflaws?
Scofflaws.
Yeah.
And knucklehead or something?
Knuckleheads. Yes,
Scofflaws
those
and
knuckleheads.
Scofflaws and knuckleheads.
I'm pulling up Twitter and I've got Mike Godwin retweeting Cory Doctorow. So I feel like
Did he call me a Nazi?
no.
There's still time.
There's still time.
Yeah.
Let the discussion go a little bit longer. We'll get there.
It's not until Mike Godwin's called you a Nazi that you
really arrived.
compromised.
Absolutely.
He uses it very sparingly.
Yeah, he's very careful about his use of it. How's it gotta feel when you're like, if you look at the engrams for your Google searches, it's your name and Nazi is
Yeah.
top other hit.
Is Mike Godwin a Nazi?
Is like,
Yeah.
let's see what Google autocomplete
There
says
you go.
about that.
I'm confused by this deal. What is it doesn't seem structural. It seems architectural,
Yeah, I think you're right.
but not particularly. Like, was that added before they added the?
It goes with the brutalist theme. It's
Yeah.
like it's
This is brutalist meets.
It's quasi-Victorian on the outside, brutalist on the inside. It's very like Southern California Disneyland simulacrum Jean Baudrillard complete.
I think it goes through on that side.
Yeah, but why? What?
I don't know.
Seismic retrofit meets postmodernism.
Yeah.
Do we want to get started? Yeah, let's get started. Kyle, how are we doing this? Do we have a microphone? Or
No, stream is good, and that's our
All right.
microphone.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Cory Doctorow. I'm a special consultant to the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Thanks to our friends at Scale. I think you wanted to say a few words before we kick off.
Definitely, yeah. So welcome to
Should I
Yeah,
move in? so
yeah,
I
come
can-
over, just
come
stand in front of me.
Step into the light, Caroline.
Okay. Yeah, welcome to the right to repair, the freedom to tinker, and the right to know. So we'll be discussing the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which has been enacted 20 years ago. I'm here on behalf of README, which is a students' rights organization here at UCLA that addresses current issues of digital rights, especially as they relate to information workers and professionals here in our Department of Information Studies. So thinking about the DMCA and the obstacle it brings for the right to repair is especially important for us, since the right to repair, the right to open devices, to know their contents, to communicate how they work, is critical for maintaining a sense of our current information environment, for ensuring access to knowledge about technology, and for preservation of digital technology, software, and data. Tonight, we're excited to have a number of experts and activists in this space here behind me to talk about the DMCA, bringing perspectives from their work and action on behalf of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, iFixit, Smartex, and Pulse. So we'd like to thank the EFF for connecting us to allies in this space, Corey Doctorow for reaching out to us to convene this conversation, and UCLA GSEIS for providing us with a space to talk here tonight. And I'll pass it over to Corey to start.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So I wanted to start by saying a few words of context about the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and Section 1201, the last 20 years and how we got here, what we've been doing today, and yesterday at UCLA here in the hearings the Copyright Office are holding. And then I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues and friends here who have all been testifying or an active part of these Copyright Office hearings here at UCLA, which happen every 3 years. So I sometimes call this a funny thing happened on the way to the 21st century. In 1998, the Clinton administration and Congress sat down and crafted this thing called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. It's a big gnarly hairball of law. You may know it as the author of your favorite videos, as in this video has been removed thanks to a claim under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. That's Section 512. We're talking about Section 1201. That's the bit that makes it illegal to bypass digital logs, access controls on copyrighted works. And in 1998, the idea was that if you made a DVD player, you might want to stop people from bringing DVDs home from like Mexico or India and playing them on their DVD player here, because you might want to sell them for cheap in overseas territories and charge more here. And you wanted to stop that parallel importation. And so what you do is you'd say that anyone who made a DVD player would have to check to see what region the disc was made in and make sure that it matched the disc, the region that the DVD player was sold in. And if it didn't match, the DVD player would refuse to play the disc. Not that it couldn't play the disc, it just wouldn't play the disc. It's the I can't let you do that, Dave, School of Computing Design. And it's important to note that that doesn't really have any nexus with copyright infringement, right? Going into a store in Mumbai and buying an authorized DVD at the price that the rights holder set for that DVD, and then taking it home to Los Angeles and watching it in your DVD player is the literal non-hyperbolic opposite of copyright infringement. Paying the rights holder what they ask for their work and then watching their work, that's not copyright infringement. That's just copyright. But there's this whole suite of things that manufacturers would like to do that aren't really covered by copyright. Kind of nice to haves, not needs to haves. Manufacturers would really like it overall if you would arrange your affairs to the benefit of their shareholders instead of your benefit. And DVDs were kind of ground zero for this, along with games consoles and a few other early technologies. And when these laws were enacted in the late 90s, activists and security researchers, computer scientists, they warned the Copyright Office and they warned Congress and they warned the administration that very soon every category device would have a copyrighted work in it because they'd all have software in it. Software is copyrightable. And that all manufacturers would need to do to force you to arrange your affairs to the benefit of the manufacturer instead of to your own benefit would be to install a kind of thin scrim of copyright lock around the device that you would have to puncture in order to use the device to your benefit instead of their benefit. So put your own ink cartridge into your printer, or get your car fixed by an independent mechanic instead of their mechanic, or use a third-party part to repair a device instead of buying the part that they charge an enormous markup on. All they need to do is design the device so that in order to affect that, there's some kind of copyright lock that sits between you and there that you might have to bypass. And then bypassing that lock becomes an offense, and providing the tools to bypass that lock becomes radioactively illegal. The statute provides for a $500,000 fine and a 5-year prison sentence for a first offense. And as the years tick by one, device categories have started to see this kind of copyright law integrated in theory to protect some kind of copyright interest in software, or to, the manufacturers might claim that it has some nexus with safety or some other thing. But in practice, it always seems that defending their copyright interests and keeping you safe and all the rest also involves you paying through the nose for stuff that you could otherwise get for free or cheap. And it's hard to believe that that's purely a coincidence. And every 3 years, the Copyright Office, as specified in the statute, holds these hearings. They hold a set in DC and they hold a set here on campus. And they ask the public to come in and talk to them about the uses that they're trying to make that are legitimate uses that a copyright law has gotten in the way of. And then they grant them a use exemption, an exemption that allows them, if they can figure out how, to jailbreak their device and make the use that is otherwise stopped by the statute. It doesn't allow anyone to provide the tool for it. There's some pretty significant limitations in this regime, but at the very least, once you're cleared to make the use, if you can figure out how to make it, or if you can find a tool somewhere out there on the internet, you can make the use even if the person providing the tool isn't supposed to be providing it to you. And so these are important proceedings. And this year, the Copyright Office, to its extreme credit, has said that they're going to have the presumption that they're going to renew the exemptions that came up in 2015. And so mostly we've been hearing about new exemptions. We've had a couple of days of hearings, and we'll have one more day tomorrow. And today we have some of the people who presented petitions for those exemptions. We're going to hear from them today, hear about the exemptions that they argued for, what they made of the questions they got asked by the Copyright Office. And then we'll take your questions and we'll have a kind of free-for-all. I remind you, a long rambling statement followed by what do you think of that is technically a question, but it's not a good one. And so who are we going to start with? We're going to start with Kyle, right? Kyle Weens is with iFixit. Kyle, maybe you can stand up, introduce yourself, and talk about what you petitioned for.
Absolutely. Yes, I run iFixit. We're a online repair community, and we have the idea that we should be able to fix all of our own stuff. iFixit's mission is to teach everybody how to fix all their things, and we've been at it ever since. I was in a dorm room at Cal Poly trying to fix my laptop, couldn't find the information, and very quickly stumbled into the world of copyright law, where it turns out that manufacturers believe that their service manuals are copyrightable and that they could use that copyright to refuse to license those manuals to anyone and just keep them secret. And so I was trying to fix my laptop. I couldn't find the service manual. I muddled my way through the repair, and I barely sort of got it fixed. And it would have gone a lot better if I'd had access to a service manual. So I decided that nobody else should have to suffer through that kind of indignity again, and I wrote my own service manual since I'd already taken it apart. And those of you that like tinkering and like taking things apart, the first time you take something apart is the hard time. After that, it's easy. And the problem is that we have so many things in our lives that the first time is usually the only time, and that's where we turn to Google and the internet. And the way that I think repair works now is if you can Google it and find information about how to fix it, then you can fix it. And if Google has no information, then you're out of luck. And so we have taken upon ourselves this idea that everything that has been made should be fixable. And we're in the position of trying to figure out for any given thing, what's the process to fix it. So a few years ago, a friend of mine, his name is Dave, he's a local farmer in San Luis Obispo, a couple hours north of here, came to me and said, hey, I've got this John Deere tractor. And I normally, I used to be able to do a lot of the repairs myself. Recently, I've had to go through the John Deere dealer, who's about an hour south of us, in order to do repairs. And I've got a problem where I've got a harvest coming up. Actually, harvest is supposed to start today, and the tractor won't start up. And I'm convinced that it's not a mechanical problem with the tractor. It's actually just a sensor that's failed. And I want to know, how can I disable this sensor so I can get the tractor to go? And I'll take the risk that the sensor isn't actually revealing some underlying problem. And he had tried to get the sensor from John Deere, and they said, yes, we're out of stock at our local warehouse. We'll send you one that's going to be 3 days before you can get another sensor. And he says, it was literally a $300,000 tractor. He says, I can't wait 3 days for my to run the harvest. I have to run it now. Can you come out with your laptop and your computer science degree and help me figure out how to fix my tractor? And so I said, sure, I'll try. And it turned out it was complicated. But as I did a little bit more research, we realized that even if I was able to technically help him using my fancy software engineering skills, it probably was going to be a violation of Section 1201. And in that moment, in the couple days window, I wasn't able to figure it out. Since then, I've learned a lot more about how John Deere protects their hardware. They have a diagnostic software that their technicians have access to that farmers don't. And so they have to come in with their laptop, plug it in. It does a handshake with the tractor and says, I'm authenticated as a John Deere technician. And then it will actually give John Deere more information, more diagnostic information about the tractor than the farmer is given access to himself. And John Deere is so protective of this information that the software that runs on this laptop is designed to auto-erase itself every 90 days. So if the technician somehow leaks the software or somebody steals his laptop, it won't work for more than 3 months. And so we applied for an exemption in the last triennial rulemaking to be able to modify and repair tractors. And John Deere fervently came out and said, no, absolutely not. The locks that we put on these tractors are very important. They're essential to the security infrastructure of the tractor, and farmers should not be able to do those kinds of repairs. In addition to that, they said, look, the farmer doesn't actually own the software that runs on the tractor. He just has an implied license to operate the software for the life of the vehicle, which was news to me, and it certainly was news to farmers. And after I showed that letter to the National Farm Bureau and the Corn Growers Association, they got very upset and they said, how can we help? And I said, well, we have this idea that maybe we can pass right to repair legislation that will, in addition to the copyright exemptions, will be able to actually help us get the access to that diagnostic software, because Deere wasn't selling the software to farmers. And so since then, we're 3-4 years later, we've had 18 states so far this year introduce right to repair legislation. We had a hearing last week in Illinois. Now they've introduced it. Don't clap yet. Don't clap yet, because this is an idea whose time has not yet come. 18 states have introduced bills. We've had a lot of hearings. California introduced a bill this year. Assemblywoman Talamantes Eggman from Stockton was awesome hero, introduced legislation. Unfortunately, the legislation has systematically been killed off or died in every state legislature it's been heard in so far this year. We have a few states left. Illinois is looking potentially promising. But overall, we've seen strident, fervent opposition from manufacturers. LG told lawmakers in Illinois this last week that if right to repair was passed, that information about how to repair LG's refrigerators would endanger the public safety. And that if all of us are fixing our refrigerators, all of a sudden we're going to be put in harm's way. And the legislators are listening, and if they don't have another voice saying, hey, this isn't credible, there isn't actually threats of people hurting themselves fixing refrigerators, or maybe there is a threat of people hurting themselves, but not if they have access to the service manual, then this is going to be an ongoing issue. So very excited to be here to be a part of this conversation. We're going to see this legislation continue to evolve. We see this issue being something that needs to be fought on two fronts. You've got the federal challenge to repair, where we have locks on systems, where manufacturers are taking advantage of Section 1201 to lock down their equipment. And we need statutory reform to 1201. And in the meantime, before we get statutory reform, we need the Copyright Office to grant some relief around some of the areas like automotive and tractor repairs where there's so many challenges. But then we also need state level reform where states can tell the manufacturers, look, you've got this diagnostic tool, make it available to the farmers so they can fix their own equipment. So we see this as a dual fight, both at the federal level and at the state level, and it's clearly happening across the country. It's even happening around the world, and I'm optimistic we're going to see something change, but it's going to be it's going to be a while. And it's going to be a hard fight to get there.
Thanks, Kyle. So I think Kyle makes a really important point, something that we talked about in the kind of big header for tonight's event, which is that property rights. You know, if any of you have ever done a first-year property law course, you'll learn Blackstone's definition of property, that which you enjoy sole and despotic dominion over to the exclusion of all other men in the universe. You know, property rights mean that it's your stuff. You bought it, you own it, you get to do stuff with it. You get to do stuff with it even if it makes the manufacturer and their shareholders sad. And foundationally, the right to own something is also the right to choose who fixes it, what you plug into it, whose consumables you buy for it. And, you know, on its face, it feels like, well, okay, but Apple really wants to decide whose apps I can buy, and maybe I can live with that. The principle that says that it should be a felony to provide you with a tool to unlock your iPhone so that you can choose whose app store you use, in principle is no different from the idea that if your toaster had a vision system, it would be a felony to provide you with a tool to let you decide whose bread you can use. We are really one RFID system away from a dishwasher that won't wash unauthorized dishes. Once the manufacturer has decided which supply chain you can use and uses copyright locks to protect that, then DMCA 1201 gives them cover of law to make that preference into a rule. And so with that, we're going to hear from our next speaker, who is Matt from Pulse.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I'll just start off by admitting that I don't know nearly half as much as any of these four people behind me know. I represent Pulse Technologies, which is a on-demand, in-home smartphone repair, TV mounting, and smart home setup service. Basically, the easiest way to sum it up is Uber for repair and service, right? So if you need your iPhone repaired, we'll come and fix it. We do your Galaxy, your Pixel, any type of TV mounting, including cutting into the wall and rewiring the electrical. We also do making sure that your Google Home works with all of those things that we just set up and did for you. I know far less about the copyright nuances of repair. What I do know is the practical implications of that. So we employ a network of about 2,000 technicians across 50 major US markets, and those technicians are all local to their areas. So when you talk about using 1201 DMCA to limit repair, you're talking about impacting those local jobs. And when you think about it in the context of manufacturers, you have to understand that they are sending their jobs, right? If you send your iPhone out to Apple to get it repaired, they don't do those repairs by and large. If it's too complicated, they don't do it at the Apple store in Omaha, Nebraska. They send it out to Denver, Colorado, to the nearest Apple facility. So now you're sending jobs out of your state. So specifically how I'm involved in all this is I've been working with Kyle on the right to repair stuff. I've been going to Nebraska and stuff in California and all over the country, Boston and soon to be LA again, for lobbying against legislators to say that we need to pass these right to repair legislation bills so that these jobs are protected, so that we can provide a better service for consumers, and so that, you know, all in all, the consumer just gets a better experience with the products that they are buying and that they buy with the expectation of ownership. By the way, we work where we're kind of interesting as opposed to traditional repair shop is we work one-on-one directly with manufacturers. So we have a partnership with Google. We have a investment. One of our investors is Samsung Next program, which invests in startups. It's an affiliate of Samsung. We are pushing very hard to work with Apple, but they just tell us go away. And so every couple of weeks, we knock on the door and say, hey, do you want to talk yet? As the new thing comes out, right? And so right now, the biggest issues that we're facing is iOS 11.3, where what Apple has done is said if you had a newer iPhone, an 8 Plus, iPhone 10, you upgraded and you happen to get a repair done not at Apple, guess what? You can't use your phone anymore. And I say that, and it kind of sounds extreme, but it actually is. You couldn't touch the screen to interact with anything going on. You could see what's going on, but you just couldn't do anything with it, right? And so Apple released a software patch to fix that, which is great news. But in the interim time of, I think, about 3 or 4 weeks where that was going on, consumers were pretty much screwed. And as a repair entity, what we had to do was recall all of those parts, tell consumers your SOL, you get to go to Apple and wait for months to get a repair appointment. And then all of a sudden Apple releases this fix. So now all of the stuff that was coming back, we say, wait, send it back out to the text and we'll do the fixes now. And this isn't just a one-off exception. We saw this with the battery issue a couple months ago where they were, I don't know the term, but they were, squeezing their hands around your battery, your phones to make them run poor. We saw it with Error 53 even more a long time ago. So that's kind of a quick summary of what we do.
Thanks, Matt. So you heard that when right to repair comes up, one of the recurring themes for the manufacturers is that this undermines our security. And it's certainly true that electronic devices have an enormous security problem. It can't have escaped any of your attention in the last year that, like, people steal whole hospitals by releasing malware. And from the computer science perspective, security is hard. But what the DMCA has done effectively is not made devices more secure. It's just made our ability to explore and report on the security devices more fraught. It's always been the case that manufacturers would like to decide who can complain about their products and point out their defects and when. And what the DMCA has done is given them an effective veto over it because, of course, people don't want to face criminal and civil liability, especially really large-scale criminal and civil liability for warning people about security defects. And because firms have been able to invoke Section 1201 whenever a security researcher comes forward and says, well, you know, I bypassed this DRM in order to see how the device was working, and I found these defects, and I published this proof of concept code, and they say, well, now you're a trafficker, and we're going to hit you for $500,000 and 5 years in prison. What we find over and over again is that researchers are being chilled from coming forward. Now, this doesn't actually make devices more secure. Right? The idea that if the researcher doesn't tell the public about a defect in a device, no one else will discover that defect and weaponize it. It's on its face kind of a silly idea, but we actually have some data now, and thanks to Stanford. So after the Vault 7 and Vault 8 CIA cyber weapon releases, or NSA cyber weapon releases, we were able to see the rate at which security defects that are discovered and kept secret are rediscovered independently and weaponized. And what we saw from those releases of government malware was that about 1 in 5 defects will be independently rediscovered and weaponized in a given year. And so when you tell a security researcher, you're not allowed to come forward and disclose the existence of your defect, you don't foreclose on malicious actors finding that defect and weaponizing. What you do is you create a kind of 1 in 5 dice roll that defect will be weaponized and used to attack everyone who's vulnerable to it until such time as it's so widely dispersed that it can no longer be denied, and then the defect becomes widely known and gets finally remediated. We have seen all kinds of bad effects of chilling researchers and their ability to come forward. One is that researchers have made a new practice for disclosing defects. Rather than asking the manufacturer in advance if they know about the defect and giving them a chance to remediate it before they come forward, because they don't want to just dump a 0 day on the world before the manufacturers had a chance to remediate it. Now, because they're worried about getting attacked, they just dump it on Pastebin, because they want the world to know about it, and they know that if they tell the manufacturer about it first, that they face liability. And the kinds of devices, the constellation of devices that DMCA 1201 affects just keeps growing. So we're seeing it in medical implants, we're seeing it in seismic dampers, we're seeing it in voting machines, we're seeing it in high-speed payment processing systems. And so all of these systems now are becoming systems that are not readily auditable by third parties. Just last year, the World Wide Web Consortium greenlit a proposal to put DRM in the browsers used by 3 billion people to conduct their finance, their personal affairs, their educations, their romances, their connections with their families, and also to control their Internet of Things devices. And now those 3 billion devices have an unauditable attack surface that no security researcher can touch without facing this liability under 1201. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jeff from Stanford, who is here giving testimony to the Copyright Office as well.
So I'll just talk about a little slice of the right to repair and what we've been helping the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries with their 1201 exemption, which is for cell phone unlocking. And you know that probably if you got a cell phone, certainly if you got it a few years ago, and quite likely if you got it today, it's locked to a particular carrier. You bought a Verizon phone, and if you want to switch that phone to AT&T or Sprint, historically, too bad. Nowadays, maybe if you're lucky, after your contract runs out, you can request that the carrier will give it to you. And because under the threat of FCC regulation, they agreed to these voluntary principles, they might give it to you. And so we've been, and I would say if I have a theme here, sort of related to what Corey was talking about importing lawfully purchased DVDs, it is, tell me again what this has to do with copyright. Because the idea is every phone has software in it, and they put a lock around the software, and the software says whether or not you are allowed to take that phone to another carrier. Most of these phones are perfectly capable of working on another carrier, and it's simply a little piece of software in there that says no. And so because these are protected by digital locks, you need to break that lock in order to unlock the cell phone without the permission of the carrier, and suddenly you're in 1201 violation line, you violated federal law. And so we've been, our students, Chris Connolly, who's here tonight, and Dylan Chur were testifying yesterday before the Copyright Office about why they should grant an exemption for people who lawfully own a mobile device to unlock that mobile device and take it to another carrier. And we already have an exemption for this, but it is limited to used devices And it is limited to one of 4 categories, which they arbitrarily, I would say semi-arbitrarily chose as cell phones, tablets, wearables, and mobile hotspots. And so we've been telling the Copyright Office, one, there's really no difference between new and used devices. There's really no reason you should have the right to take a device that you lawfully purchased and bring it to another carrier if it was already used on the carrier, but not if it wasn't already activated. And 2 is, this is the age of the Internet of Things. There's no reason that we should be limited to these enumerated categories. The NTIA told the Copyright Office that these categories are blurring and disappearing, and it's really hard to even tell what's a phone and what's a tablet today. Leaving aside the many, many, many types of devices that now have software, are now becoming cellular activated, like home security systems or irrigation systems or your car. So our students were telling the Copyright Office yesterday about why there should be an exemption for unlocking your devices and taking them to another carrier. And I just want to return to that same question, which is, tell me again what this has to do with copyright. Breaking this lock isn't about getting access to software that you're going to copy and take to your other phone somewhere else. This is about flipping a single bit that says, yes, I can take my phone to another carrier. So that is what Stanford has been helping ISRI do, and good to be a part of this.
Thanks, John. So half a millennium ago, before we had science, we had a thing that looked a lot like science. It was called alchemy. And alchemists did a lot of things similar to what scientists would do. They would observe some phenomena in the universe, and they would formulate a hypothesis about their causal relationships, and then they would run an experiment to see whether or not they understood the causal relationship. And then that's where science and alchemy diverges. Scientists tell people what they think they've learned so that their enemies can tell them about the stupid mistakes they've made, and their friends or their enemies can call them idiots for having made the mistakes, their friends can gently point them out. Alchemists never told anyone about what they'd learned. So no one ever pointed out their mistakes, which is how every alchemist discovered in the hardest way possible that they shouldn't drink mercury, right? When we create a regime that says that in order to investigate a product, you have to keep what you learn to yourself, we return to a pre-rational era. We return to an era in which our peers can no longer audit our work. More importantly, the manufacturers become kind of practitioners of alchemy. The idea that any company is so smart that they can find all of their defects and don't need the rest of us to put our eyes on what they think they know to escape their groupthink, I mean, it's a dead letter on its face. 500 years ago, only a small class of people were allowed to own property, and everyone else had to be a tenant of that property and use it in the way that the owner of that property gave permission for. We call that feudalism. Today, we have a kind of new feudalism where only these kind of transhuman artificial colony life forms called limited liability corporations get to truly own property in that sense of despotic dominion over a device to the exclusion of all other people. And the rest of us are rapidly disappearing under this regime in which we have to use our devices in compliance with the rules they set, even if we think we've bought them, because it turns out we're only licensors. We have John Deere saying you've only licensed your tractor. GM wrote a letter in support of it. It turns out when they said that that's not your father's Pontiac, they were speaking literally. Like, your father never owned that Pontiac, and neither can you. So this, it's great to tinker around the margins with this at our 1201 hearings every 3 years. And at EFF, we're really proud to do that work. But we need a better fix. And so that's why EFF is suing the US government on behalf of 2 of our clients to question the constitutionality of 1201 and to restore some of these traditional rights that have been part of our lives really for 500 years, and that we have no reason to abandon at this moment in which our devices are becoming more powerful, not less, in which they're becoming more entwined and more intimate with our lives and not less. And so that brings me to our last speaker tonight. Kit is a lawyer at EFF. She happens to be the lawyer who's running this case for us. And she also gave some testimony today and will be testifying tomorrow.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kit Walsh. I'm a senior staff attorney at EFF. And my fellow panelists have done a great job highlighting a lot of the features of this law, particularly the way that it lets manufacturers impose their preferences on what you do with the devices that you rely on in your lives. One thing that's really unusual about this law is that it doesn't just govern what you do, It also governs what you're allowed to know. So by creating a ban on accessing copyrighted works, which can be the software in your device, this is the law that gets in the way if you want to figure out if your Volkswagen is cheating on emissions, if you want to figure out if your kid's doll is recording their voice and sending it back to a server somewhere. You want to figure out if any of the cameras or microphones pointed at your living room are taking advantage of your trust for the benefit of the manufacturer. And that enforced ignorance is really uncommon. That's not something that traditionally was permissible under any kind of intellectual property law. Once a device is out there, you get to buy it, you get to take it apart, you get to understand it, fix it, make it better, etc. And that's part of the unintended consequence of Section 1201 that's really troubling. EFF is a civil liberties organization. We care a lot about your autonomy, your ability to protect your privacy, and your ability to make the changes you want to see in the world. You achieve all of those things using technology. So when, let me step that back. Technology is integral to amplifying your impact. Ideally, technology is a tool that allows you to amplify your impact in the world. Section 1201 is a big impediment to that because as we've heard, it can mean that your technology is always an agent of the manufacturer. They're the ones ultimately in control of what it can do, where you can fly your drone, etc. I'm going to tell a sort of personal origin story, which is that when I was an undergraduate, I was a neuroscience undergraduate, and I was building things that connect electronics to nervous systems. And ultimately, the goal is either create a prosthetic component that can help with neurodegenerative diseases, create interfaces between you and your computers. And as I learned about the way that the law treats your rights with respect to digital technology, I got really concerned about making that technology a reality in the world. I want you to ultimately be in control of what your mind, your body, the devices that are intimate parts of your lives are doing. And that's part of our work to prevent Section 1201 from getting in the way of your use of technology to advance the things that are important to you.
Thanks, Kit. So this is audience participation time. You are welcome to identify yourself, although not required to. We're believers in EFF. And if you have questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
And let's repeat the question.
And we'll repeat the question for the camera. Good thought. You first. Yeah.
Hi, I'm MC Farrell. I'm a doctoral student at USC. I've met several members of the panel before. My question is specifically about the issue that, I forget who mentioned it, that right now the exemptions address the owner of the object, but not people who want to help develop products or how-tos or things like that, you know, like third-party people who would be part of the repair thing, even if they don't own the thing. And so my question is there any way that the DMCA exemption process could help us make these exceptions available to third parties? And if not, what are other ways that we're trying as a movement, as a right to repair movement, to make it so that those repair how-tos and products are accessible?
So the question broadly is about, to repeat for the camera, is about tools, about the right to make and circulate tools and instructions and other material that will help people who aren't you make use of it. After all, software is like these kind of great self-executing recipes where it's not like a hammer where I get really good at a hammer and then I give you the hammer. You're not good with the hammer, but I can get really good at code and write a program, and you can run the program as well as I could. And so can we find a way within the 1201 exemption process or through some other process to address this tools conundrum? Maybe Kit, you're the best one to talk about.
Maybe I'll talk about state right to repair.
Sure.
Yeah. So the tools issue is in large part something that arises from the way the statute is written, because there are a bunch of separate prohibitions on different activities that you might undertake. One is the act of circumventing to get access to something, and a separate provision is providing the tools and services trafficking. There's not a ton of case law about what that means, but in the first instance, we and others have spoken to Congress and the Copyright Office about that. The Copyright Office suggested that Congress revisit that issue at the level of a legislative change to make exemptions more helpful. And we've also suggested some ways that within the scope of the Copyright Office's statutory mandate, they can avoid narrowing exemptions in unnecessary ways. So for instance, the repair exemption excluded third parties entirely, but there are third-party activities that we think do not rise to the level of conduct that's prohibited under the anti-tools, anti-services provision. And so that's an immediate opportunity for the Copyright Office and the Librarian of Congress, who's the ultimate decider, to take a step forward in the context of the rulemaking process. And the broader, very clear legislative fix would, of course, be welcome as well.
Yeah, you have to have tools in order to do these repairs. And increasingly, those tools involve software. They're relatively complex. I'll tell you a story about another friend of mine who's a local farmer in San Luis Obispo, who is not Dave. And I'm not going to tell you who he is because he probably would prefer, he definitely prefer I didn't identify him. So he actually has John Deere's diagnostic software. And I said, how did you get it? He said, oh, well, there's this forum, and I found out that if I put $5,000 in a duffel bag and I leave it under a park bench at a certain time, a laptop will appear that then has the diagnostic software on it. And at that point, once he's got the software, then he can do the work. And that was really the light bulb moment that was, okay, so the Copyright Office has said that it's very challenging for them to legalize the development and sale of tools. So if I can't go out and as a software engineer, build the tool and distribute it because it's a violation of 1201, what I can do is go and pass a law that requires John Deere make that tool available to farmers. And then if John Deere is providing you with the tool, then it's not a circumvention. And so that's the approach. So that's what, because of the approach that the Copyright Office has taken, it's really driving us towards state level right to repair legislation. And if you look at the bill that's being introduced in those 18 states, it says you must make available to consumers access to service information, security updates, and diagnostic software for maintaining equipment under the same terms that you make it available to your dealer networks. So we've got two approaches. One is looking at how do we fix the federal law so that we can make our own tools. And then as a reaction to this interpretation of federal law, you have states stepping in and saying, all right, well, we're just going to completely change the market and require the manufacturers to make the tools available.
Yeah, and just to close that out, we have a board member, Pam Samuelson, who takes a slightly different view to ours. And she thinks, she teaches at UC Berkeley. She's one of the country's leading copyright scholars. And she says, well, there's some exemptions where it's hard to imagine how the tool exemption could be squared up. But the other exemptions where they're very broad, right? An exemption that allows you to jailbreak an iPhone it's broad, and it doesn't, anyone is allowed to do it. It's not limited to service technicians or left-handed people or Wednesdays or whatever. You are always allowed to jailbreak your iPhone. And she says, well, the statute says you can't produce a tool to jailbreak a covered product. But once the Copyright Office says you're allowed to jailbreak the product, it's not covered anymore. And then the tool should be legal too. I don't think Pam's found any takers to be her test case yet, but I mean, she's not whistling Dixie, right? She's when Pam says something like this with some certainty, it's because she's thought hard about it, and there are very few people in this country as qualified as she is to think hard about it and have an opinion on it. Certainly, I'm not as qualified as she is. There's a question behind back there. Yeah.
I almost forgot it, but I know it has to do with Internet of Things, and as our households become more IoT, and it goes beyond Alexa, beyond our refrigerators, and beyond those industrial devices, and gets into things like lights and safety and locks. How does that connect to manufacturers saying, we want to make sure our system is secure, and that we can sort of the Apple methodology of, we've made a perfect system, nobody else can.
So the question is, like, once IoT pervades our lives and there are security dimensions, your CO2 monitor, your fire monitor, your locks, and so on, when the manufacturer says, well, we can't guarantee that your door stays locked if you plug a third-party gadget into our device, how do we square that up? Anyone want to take that?
We can't. Right. Okay. Yeah, so I like to say that software is eating the world. Software is moving into our gizmos. If you take a 32-bit microcontroller, the kind of thing that powered the first computer that I owned, I remember was a 16 megahertz computer, right? So 32-bit microcontroller, it's 25 cents these days. And it can run, you can have hundreds of thousands of lines of source code on that 25-cent microcontroller. And so we have the world, you're talking about property, personal property, that the kinds of laws that govern what we can do with our personal property. The moment that you add software to it, all of a sudden now our intellectual property regime, and it becomes under the aegis of the Copyright Office and all of these additional restrictions. So the moment you add a microchip to something, it completely changes what our rights are. And I would argue that it moves from a world where it's relatively intuitive to, I would challenge anyone to find an intuitive way to navigate the current set of DMCA exemptions. It was a very carefully constructed way of slicing the baby into 37 pieces. So where do we go in a world where Internet of Things is moving electronics into everything? We were having a conversation with the Copyright Office yesterday about not just is it electronics moving into everything, but pretty much everything has cellular connectivity. I've been noticing all of these electric scooters that are floating around now that are relatively controversial. Okay, well, all of those have a cellular chip so they can report their locations. And so is it legal to unlock a scooter to move it from one cellular carrier to another? Nobody thought about that until we did yesterday. And all of a sudden, I was wondering if the city of San Francisco impounds all these scooters and then wants to resell them, are they going to have to unlock the cellular connection before they, like, what is the value of the scooter to the city of San Francisco? And do they have the ability? So these are really fundamental questions, and it impacts every single product that we're touching. And I think it's really been underestimated by society how much of an impact this is going to have. And I think that's why this is such a hugely important inflection point. If you think about where is society going the next 100 years, the decisions that we make now, the decisions that the Copyright Office makes now are going to have a huge shape in whether we're moving toward a world with more freedom or a world with less.
Go ahead.
And one thing I just want to add to that is that simply because adding connectivity and adding microprocessor capability to all the things that we already have in our lives gives us the capability to lock in these ecosystems doesn't mean that it makes sense to do so or that it's good to do so. I'm sure when we first got electricity and lighting in our houses, the manufacturers would have loved it if they could have wired it so that you could only use the lighting that they provided. They just lacked the technical means to mandate that. I mean, you know, AT&T back in the day did a pretty good job of mandating that you could only use an black AT&T phone that you rented from them until they were ultimately forced to give up that monopoly. So the fact that this new technology creates a technical barrier that allows them to create these closed ecosystems doesn't mean that we necessarily want the force of federal law to enforce that.
Do you want to add something?
Yeah. How many of you have ever heard of the Nest thermostat? Great. So have you ever heard of the Revolve thermostat? It was acquired by Google, and it worked perfectly fine, and it allowed you to control the climate in your home. And Google said, well, this competes with Nest, so we're just going to shut it down, right? And overnight, all of these consumers that had this thermostat in their home, it just didn't work. And Google said, sorry, you're SOL. And that's kind of, you know, there's really no harm except for the inconvenience that happens to you. But we were actually reading an article yesterday from ZDNet talking about 17 things that are on the internet that are connected that should not be connected, right? And one of them was a hydroelectric dam. And just the notion that a manufacturer, somebody that released that software, that equipment that allowed you to make that connected, right? Saying, we don't really want to support it anymore because it's just too hard. And then that individual third-party hackers, whatever you want to call them, they couldn't go and code something that would continue to support that required little to no effort, just because the manufacturer decided we don't want to do that anymore. The implication is when you're talking about a thermostat are very little. When you're talking about a hydroelectric dam, that's huge. And when you're talking about autonomous vehicles, if Tesla goes under tomorrow, what happens to all those vehicles that are out there on the lots? Does GM get to step in and say, well, sorry, you guys can't do this stuff? And so like the practical implication for me from a Pulse perspective is that we need to have a way to continuously support these smart home things long after these manufacturers are gone, because they come and go. GE has a really down year this last year. Sears is going under. Tesla, there's all this, you know, all these things that are building these smart connected things. They may not always be around, but what we do know is that dedicated smart individuals, like all these 4 people behind me, will be there to help us code the software that we need to keep those things running long after those manufacturers are gone.
Yeah, I'm going to call on you next and then you. So before there was ransomware, there was robotic car parking garages. where you drive your car in and the robot puts it in a slot. And it turns out that if you own one of those and you have a dispute with the software vendor, they have a really easy way to settle the dispute. They turn off your garage and they trap hundreds of cars in it until you pay them the licensing fee, right? There are lots of good reasons in a market economy that you would want to have a multiplicity of vendors so that you can negotiate as an equal with the people in your supply chain and not just have to capitulate the minute you and they have an argument. Imagine if the last time you had an argument with a company about who was in the right and who was in the wrong, they could just reach in and shut it off. And now imagine that it's your artificial pancreas that you're arguing about. And you get to see why, even in, and especially in the most sensitive applications, you really want to be sure that you have the owner override. You have the next question, sir.
Yeah, I have two questions really. One is kind of about the planned obsolescence in old devices, like even I think an iPhone 5 right now, you can't download any of the newest apps and stuff on it, and unless you've already downloaded the app, Apple isn't going to let you download it again. And so I was wondering, is there any movement in that direction? Because in California, I think manufacturers are forced to make the parts for a thing that's sold for 7 years, but they're not required to support the software for even 10 minutes. So are you guys trying to help with that fight? And the other thing is, what can we do as individuals, apart from voting? Can we put our money out of this company or towards that company? Like, who should we boycott?
So the question is about planned obsolescence. In California, we have statutes that require firms to continue to make parts, but not to continue to support software. What can we do in California and in the world to vote with our wallets or vote with our votes, with our ballot papers, or with some other means to ensure that that's always available? And also, what other action is underway? So, when do you want to take that?
I can take it, and then maybe Kit can continue. Yeah, so the law that you're referring to is California's Lemon Law, and it says that manufacturers must provide service for products for 7 years from the sale date. That's actually the longest law of any jurisdiction in the world. Turkey actually matches California for 7 years. Only jurisdictions in the world that have the 7-year mandate. And so it's interesting, if you have a 6-year-old laptop from Apple in Oregon, Apple won't support it, but they will support it here. Unfortunately, the way the law was written, they only have to provide service. That's service provided by their monopoly providers. It's not service through independent. So it doesn't mean Apple has to sell you parts. It just means Apple has to provide some kind of hardware service. So this is great. Clearly, we need these kind of laws in other states. We need to expand it to cover selling parts and making diagnostics available. So that's where right to repair comes in. Let me talk about right to repair, and then maybe I'll let Kit take the software aspect.
Kyle, can you mention your right to repair or your repair coalition eye-popping headline figures about jobs created by repair and recycling?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So if you look, and I mean, right to repair, we're talking about civil liberties, and it's certainly a digital rights issue, but it's also fundamentally just a local small business issue. If you think about, if you take a typical American town and you distill it down to its essence, you pretty much have a post office and an auto repair shop and a convenience store, right? That's the central locus of an American community, and that auto mechanic is probably fixing more things for you than just your car. Illinois Economic Department did a study, and they found that for every 1,000 tons of electronics that are landfilled, it creates way less than 1 job. For every 1,000 tons of electronics that you recycle, it creates something like 10 jobs. And if you process those same electronics and you repair them and bring them back to the market, it creates 250 green jobs. So that's really where we want to see, and that's actually how we've gotten a lot of Republicans on board with right to repair. Right to repair is very much a bipartisan issue. We have Republicans in Tennessee and Nebraska and Wyoming introducing right to repair. We have Democrats in California introducing right to repair. It's very much a broad grassroots issue. So you asked how you can get engaged. Right to repair is very much at an individual activist level. I mean, we're at the very beginning of this. It's much less organized than even some of the other fights we're familiar with, like net neutrality. It's a very, very small group of people, and we need all of the volunteer activists that we can get working on the issue. It's absolutely something that we can have an impact on. And I don't really believe in political corruption to the degree that some people online might say. I mean, the politicians really want to do what their constituents are asking, and they will listen if we show up. What the professional lobbyists have is more time and more dedication, and they're in Sacramento talking more frequently. And so if we can spend an equivalent amount of time or outspend them in time, over the long run, I think we've really got the opportunity to beat them. But it's going to take dedication. It's going to take a lot more resources than I have to bear. It's going to take all of you in your spare time.
And what's the URL where you go to?
Repair.org is the organization that's putting together all of the work. And you can, if you're interested in any particular state, if you go to california.repair.org, we have a handy form where you can write your legislator, or even you punch in your phone number, we'll call you and connect you with your legislator. Yeah, yourstate.repair.org. To answer the software question, because I think software obsolescence is really interesting. Do you have a perspective on what we should do about these apps that are?
I think, mirroring what you said about the lemon law, it's important that we have a solution that allows for competition. That's the ideal. A solution that reinforces the monopoly. Maybe you can get your device repaired and updated, but it's not the ideal as compared to a world where there's competition for that service.
Yeah, go, please.
So one solution that I realized is there's this guy named Jay Freeman that releases these hacks for the iOS software, right? That allows you to actually keep your iPhone 5 updated to the current OS features, and even to push out some maybe security features for your phone that would otherwise keep it running. And so I would say that the one way that you can continue to support that, because it's the theory in the jailbreaking community right now, is that nobody's jailbreaking anymore because nobody's actually just using the jailbreaks, right? And so it's to keep using those jailbreaks so that there's an inclination for the people that are doing it to continue to look for those exploits in Apple's OS software, so that we can still support the iPhone 5 and even further back. Kyle was using an iPhone 4S up until a year ago. Yeah, so I think it's totally possible. I just think that it requires people.
Exists.
Right.
If I were to hand you an iPhone 4 right now, you would not be able to get a single app on it.
Right. And then you had the next question. Yeah, go ahead.
Talking a lot about embedded devices and the right to repair things, but I haven't heard so much about the right to access things that you're entitled to access, either because you paid for it or maybe more compellingly because you created it. I found a big box of floppies in my parents' house that had hundreds of Apple II discs, and I was able to buy a thing on eBay and just copy them all to use my computer. And when we talk about companies going away, how many, someone 20 years from now are going to be able to go back and necessarily reconstruct their teenage life, and access things. I just wondering, this seems like it's an obstacle to, it's copying some people's protection, but it's inhibiting your own ability to access things that you own copyright to. And is there any exemption discussion or anything?
So the question is about accessing copyrighted works in the more traditional sense, programs and games and things that you made yourself that you might have kicking around in old floppies. I have logo programs I wrote in 1979 in an Apple II Plus on my laptop that made the transition from 5.5-inch floppies into 3.25-inch floppies onto a hard drive and so on. Yesterday we did hear from someone who's involved in this. We heard from a group of people who are working on preserving early multiplayer games. They'd like to preserve later multiplayer games as well, but they're starting with really early ones. Games that were designed for the Commodore 64, dialing up to AOL. And these are games that people really felt very strongly about and feel very strongly about. And there's a lot of energy that goes into it. It's a very difficult thing to do because you're reconstructing the server software just by looking at the client. There's often some very baroque DRM elements that they have to jailbreak. Yesterday we heard about a 4-year effort to bring back a game. What was it called? Habitat? Habitat. Neohabitat.org is where you can play it now, where there was a tiny bit of code that was used in the AOL sign-on. And they spent a year and a half negotiating with AOL to get the right to use this code. The creator of the game had given them the source code. They had cooperation from everyone involved except AOL. AOL got bought by Verizon, and just before they were supposed to get this and have a press release about how great AOL was to bring back this piece of ancient history, they just killed the whole deal. Year and a half of these people's work. And they were asking for the right to go on jailbreaking devices or software to get there, but also to use volunteers, because the exemption they had only let them use people who worked for their museum. And they wanted to use volunteers all over the world. And one of the things we heard from the other side on this was, well, these volunteers that you're talking about, they're people who are already engaged in preservation work before there's an exemption. They're scofflaws. They use that word. They're scofflaws. Why should we trust them to stay within the lines if we give them this? And Kit, you're more familiar with all the exemptions that we've heard this year and the last one around. Do you have any more preservation examples like that?
So first of all, if you're really sure that it's all your own stuff on the thing, you can authorize yourself to do the circumvention and avoid the issue that way. But my sense is that I'm not as familiar with all of the archival exemptions. Seems like none of us are, because we're here to talk right to repair, but it is really important. It is something that we seek. And my impression is that in general, if there's an institution that's interested in, we have audience wisdom. Oh, okay. Cool. If there's an institutional entity that wants to do it, that gets treated more favorably in the rulemaking process than if it's a community, say, people who are attached to a video game and want to keep it going, or individuals who want to do their own archival work. That tends to be less favored. But as for the details, I can't give you all the outlines.
Like engineering, reverse engineering format of the file, for example,
Well,
or breaking DRM and all that.
So breaking DRM, yes. It may be that to reverse engineer the format of the file is not a violation of section 1201. So things like encryption or a password, those are things that are clearly contemplated by section 1201. But if it wasn't put in place to control access to the work, if it's just, I need to know the facts about sort of how to read this format, that's not necessarily something that's going to trigger the law.
So yeah, Dan Bricklin, who created the first spreadsheet, VisiCalc, has written a lot about how all his own records are in VisiCalc, and how when they ship VisiCalc, they put a defective sector on the floppy disk so that they could tell whether you copied it. Because if that sector could be read, it was on a copy, and if it couldn't be read, it was on the original. And now, because none of the floppy emulators allow you to emulate a defective sector, he can't run VisiCalc, can't access his own history. I think maybe one last question. Was there anyone else going to ask a question, burning to ask a question? Maybe we'll get one last question, so no pressure.
Yeah. Well, I know that you just mentioned that a lot of you are maybe not working so much on the archival exemptions, but one thing that we've been talking about amongst our group is thinking about what are some of like the sort of more conceptual arguments. So like we've spoken about like individual property rights, and I know that there are exemptions related to fair use, but if there are any sort of ways of thinking about right to repair in a kind of philosophical sense for the better good of knowledge sharing society, so things that might affect libraries and archives, sort of maybe speculate on what that language could be.
That sounds kind of up your alley.
Yeah.
The question is about like, how do you conceptualize it in a kind of greater public good?
Sure. Yeah, so people ask me all the time, who would want to fix a VCR? And the answer is librarians, right? Every librarian needs to fix a VCR because we have mountains of all of this footage, and VCRs. Has anybody taken apart a VCR? I have. Okay, so they're pretty complicated, right? So we spent I think Jeff this morning and Matt and I, we went down to Homeboy Industries here in LA. So if you're familiar with Homeboy Industries, they give jobs to ex-convicts and people that would have a hard time otherwise fitting into society. They give them job training, and one of the things that they do is electronics recycling. And it just, I spend a lot of time in electronics recyclers. It's kind of a hobby of mine to see what happens to all of our stuff, where it goes. And what you might not realize about electronics recyclers is that most of the money that they make is actually from reuse and repair, not from recycling. So if I were to take a phone and recycle it and melt it down and get the gold and the copper out of it, there's something like 50 cents of raw material value in this phone. So if I can fix it and sell it for $50, clearly I'm going to be making a lot more money. So that's how you employ more people. And at Homeboy Industries, their primary goal is just to create jobs. So as many things as they can possibly fix, the better. They also happen to be here in Los Angeles, hub of the entertainment industry for the world. And so therefore home of lots and lots of different kinds of media. And so it turns out that the Homeboy Industries Recycling Center really specializes in repairing old media devices. They specialize in fixing VCRs, and he showed us some Game Boy not Game Boys. We had
Walkman,
Walkmans.
yeah.
These Walkmans were completely
Original.
disassembled. And they're fixing Walkmans, and he told me that the value of certain Walkman models after the most recent Guardians of the Galaxy movie came out, where he's got the Walkman, has skyrocketed. They used to be worth $50, and now they're worth $500 because everybody wants Walkmans all of a sudden. And cassette, they spend a lot of time doing repairs of cassette players, which is fabulous, but they're mechanical devices, kind of like VCRs. They break a lot, and a lot of the parts aren't available. And so he was asking me if I could 3D model some of the gears in some of these old players so that they can print them, because he says every single vinyl gear that I have has deteriorated and failed, and the whole thing is not functional because of just this one part. So I think we're going to increasingly see that it takes creativity and a community to come along and support these devices. And this is an area where I feel like 1201 has set up a bit of an adversarial relationship between the manufacturers and the community, and that's not a place that I want to be. If Sony made the VCR back in the 1980s, they made the product, they supported it under the warranty, and a while after that, it's not Sony's fault that the VCR that I'm using 30 years later has broken. It's not even their responsibility to maintain it. Pass that responsibility off to the community. Let the librarians and the recyclers and the repair community, let us figure out how to maintain your product. Unfortunately, 1201 has said, even 30 years later, I have to go back and I have to ask them for permission. And it almost denies them the ability to pass responsibility off to the community. And that's something that I think is really unfortunate. Is let us support these products ourselves. We'd love to do it. We'd love to build wikis online. We'd love to open source everything we know, create these models, publish the models into the public domain. And so that's where you're going to see the recycling community and the repair community come in and hopefully work to solve that problem.
Yeah.
Would you like to speak to
I have
that?
another sort of philosophical angle on it, because one of the questions here is whether you get to exercise your conscience and make choices about how you use technology. It can be very attractive to manufacturers and even to regulators to say, well, we have the ability to physically stop you from doing a whole range of activities, so we're going to use that lever. And that doesn't allow for unforeseen beneficial uses. It doesn't allow for civil disobedience. It impedes social change and the advancement of alterations to the law. If you were physically prevented from being homosexual by the law, that would be a big problem, and it would impede the advancement of society to the point where it was, oh, that's not a good rule to have. So that's another philosophical take that might be interesting. Do you exercise your human conscience, or do the devices in your life define the scope of what you're physically capable of doing?
I think that's really well said. Did you want to say something?
I'll have a very, very short thing, because I think that they both cover it very well, which is that defaults matter and permission structures matter. So in the sort of world we've been used to living in, if you have a thing, you can do what you want with it. And that was the default. And now if we change the default so that you need to ask permission, and you change the default so that Sony needs to give you permission, you've made it harder on everyone, because Sony doesn't want to spend the time and energy to figure out whether they can give you a contract that will allow you to fix your 30-year-old Walkman. They just want to be able to do it. So it's really about why are we imposing a permission structure on something we as a society long to our benefit had the ability to do without.
Do you want to say anything before we close out?
No, I don't think I can say anything nearly as good as, again, anybody else can. The only thing that keeps running through my mind from a philosophical question is just jobs. When I was at Nebraska State Legislature hearing and seeing the local farmer and, a local repair shop guy that had just had his shop broken into come in and testify about how much how many jobs he's getting from local community members bringing their devices in for him to be fixed. Or for them to be fixed by him, it was just inspiring, because then it makes you realize that these guys are from that area. They are not from anywhere outside. And I think that they're best served to serve their community. And I think, like Kit says, it has a lot of repercussions further to society than really just immediately, hey, I can get my phone fixed. It's actually that, hey, I can get my phone fixed and get closer to my community as a whole through it. And I know Kyle and iFixit have done Fix-It clinics, in San Luis Obispo and all over the world they're happening, and those types of things draw that community together, and ultimately it makes society just better as a whole for it.
Yeah, I'm going to finally address it as well. I'm a recovering library worker, and So I feel really strongly about libraries. And I think that there's a category error we make about them. We say like, well, libraries existed to collect books under a roof. And now that we have the internet, we don't need them because now everyone has all the information we need. That's like saying, now that we have all have the plague, we don't need doctors, right? The job of a librarian was not to aggregate all the books under the roof. It was to help convene communities of practice and interest and help them navigate giant, difficult information spaces that only got more giant and difficult. And one of the things that repairing and building your own technology does is it gets you down to the bare metal. It gives you a kind of information and digital literacy that allows you to exercise your conscience, to be the sole and despotic master of this tool instead of being its vassal. And ultimately, like, there's a reason that you're not a samurai until you can make your own sword. Once you can build and fix your own gear, you have a relationship with it that is foundationally different. And if we want to have a generation of people who are active participants in their own future, and in the world that we live in, which is dominated by these general purpose devices where software is eating everything, they have to be able to fix them. They have to be able to open them up, change them, reconfigure them, and make them suit their needs. So I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. I'd really like to thank the folks from README who helped organize it. You guys were great. And we'll be live tweeting tomorrow's last day of the hearings. Should be a good one. There's an aviation jailbreaking bit, and that's going to be good. At EFF Live, at EFF Live.
And what, can you explain more about public?
Oh yeah, well, I don't know. Will they open it in the morning? Does anyone know?
It's just in the afternoon.
Yeah, but will they open the sign-up sheet? So there's a sign-up sheet for the public to speak at the end of the event. I put my name down. I think if you come down to the law school, it's on the first floor, 14 something. 13, 14.
Yeah.
You can put your name on the list and come and speak. Don't be weird, but do come and say interesting, cogent things.
Yes, you can, and don't be weird.
Yeah. There you go.
Fantastic.
Well, thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. I was about to protect everyone's First Amendment right to be weird. So, be weird.